I recently bought my first grill. It's a charcoal Big Joe 1, and I've been playing around with it trying to learn how to use it, but I recently put it to the ultimate test. For the 4th of July, I made a brisket for my family, and it's safe to say I learned a ton of lessons, and I still have a lot of questions after my first smoke, but I had a lot of fun, and I figured I'd take you along on the journey just to show you what I did and what I learned. As you should know by now, I'm not an expert of any kind of cooking, and I don't have any form of formal education, but I've been using this channel to show you my research and show you my experience and what I'm learning along my journey of cooking. So I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot to this process of smoking brisket. I researched a ton of videos on YouTube and a bunch of articles I found online, and I kind of just weighed my options and decided what I wanted to do because there's a few contradicting points out there, but this is what I decided to do. So I started 2 days early by grabbing my whole prime brisket that I found at Sam's. It was about 13.5 pounds. I took it out of the packaging and dabbed off most of the moisture with some paper towels, and then I went about trimming this beast. I don't have any kind of carving knife, so I went with my chef's knife, which was a little difficult, but I think I got it done. I tried to remove most of the fat and silver skin from the meat side of the brisket, while simultaneously trying to keep it from having any divots or any pockets to where fat could pool up while it was cooking. I also tried to trim off any of the big chunky edges of fat and any points that would kind of stick out during cooking and burn easier. And from the fat side, I just tried to trim everything down to about 1/4 inch of fat on the fat cap. This job was not perfect by any means, and it took me like 30 to 40 minutes because I was just trying to be extra careful and trying to get every point that I could. But in the end, I think I ended up with a pretty decently trimmed brisket, although I'm definitely going to buy a carving knife now. Then it came time for me to season my brisket, and I was going to do an overnight or actually 2-night dry brine in the fridge. So I think the most prominent flavor in a good brisket rub should be black pepper, and freshly ground at that. So I spent a couple minutes and ground up about 3 tablespoons worth, and to that I added 2 tablespoons of kosher salt as well as 1 tablespoon of Tony's Cajun seasoning, 1 tablespoon of garlic powder, and 1 tablespoon of mustard powder. I see a lot of people using mustard as a binder for the seasoning, but that's when they're not doing an overnight brine. So I figured I would use the dry form of it to put into the dry brine. So I shook all of those up to combine, and there's my rub. I generously sprinkled that all over every surface on the brisket and rubbed it in. And as best as I could, I tried to mop up all the extra seasoning that fell down onto the tray underneath, and I propped all this up onto a cooling rack to let air flow underneath and help dry out the whole crust of the brisket, and I placed the whole thing in my fridge to begin my dry brining process. Also, you may have noticed that I was saving all of the trim fat into a pot off on the side. I saw a few people rendering this out into some tallow to inject back into the brisket. I also saw other people injecting like water with seasonings or some kind of beef broth into the brisket, but I just decided to use this fat because we already had it and I wouldn't have to buy anything else. So I just added a cup of water to the pot to help render out the fat, and I just put it over the lowest heat that I had. I stirred things maybe about every 15 to 20 minutes to prevent sticking and burning, but after about 2 hours I was left with this melted fat, and then I discarded the solids on top. Once it was fairly cool, I took a meat injector and just started to put it into the flat side of the brisket. The point has enough fat inside and outside that we don't need to inject into it, so I was just doing this on one half of it. But I learned that it helps keep the inside juicy and moist where the flat can kind of dry out because it's smaller and thinner, so I was hoping for the same results here. Then I just put the brisket back into the fridge to finish its 36-hour dry brine. And I had some leftover tallow, so I poured that into a mason jar and left it in my fridge, so now I have an extra fat to use while cooking. And one last task for the day, I took a mixture of half apple cider vinegar and apple juice, and I poured those into one of these spray bottles because I'm going to be spraying the brisket throughout the cooking process to keep it moist and develop a good bark on the outside. This is also why I didn't include any sugar in my rub like some recipes do. I feared that too much sugar can caramelize on the outside and start to burn with such a long cook, so I figured the sugar in the apple juice was going to be enough for us in this recipe. Okay, so now the day before cooking, there's not much for us to do except for prep the grill, so I'm going to scrape out any remaining ashes at the bottom of the bowl and then pull out my ashtray and clean that out as well. And then I'm dumping a whole lot of charcoal, almost filling the entire bowl with it. This is an area where I read a lot of contradicting information. Some people use a charcoal snake, some people use very little charcoal, some people use a lot of charcoal, but in my past experience so far with this grill, it's so big that I felt like I needed a lot of fuel to last that long, and I figured messing with the vents would help me to not overheat the grill and to keep a low temperature going the whole time, but you'll see what happens. I also filled up almost all of my chimney. Again, I read a lot of controversy here as well. Some people say you need very little, and then some people say you need the whole chimney to last for the whole cook. I went somewhere in the middle, about 3/4 full, and again, I thought I could use the vents to my advantage. I also dispersed 3 large chunks of hickory wood into the coals on the grill. This is going to serve as the smoking wood, and I decided not to soak it because a lot of people say that doesn't do anything at all. And I'm going to leave my grill unassembled because I'm still going to have to come back tomorrow and pour hot coals over it. So that's it for day 2. So now on the 4th, I woke up at 4 a.m. to make sure that I could have this done by dinner time. The first two things I immediately did were grab the brisket out of the fridge and put it on the counter to start letting it come to room temperature, as well as getting a fire starter under my chimney and lighting that so the coals could start to light. Now after about 20-ish minutes, the coals were lit enough and the smoke was running clear, so I dumped those over the coals in my grill and started to let that come to temperature as well. And here's another one of those contradictory points that I was trying to figure out, but I couldn't get a clear answer through my research. Most sources say you're supposed to light all of your coals first and wait for your smoke to change from white to clear, because that thick white smoke doesn't taste good and it'll kind of ruin your food. But then with methods like the snake, or just methods like lighting some of your coals and letting the rest light over the process of cooking, that directly contradicts the advice from before, because some of the coals are going to be lighting throughout the process and giving off that white smoke before they're fully lit. But I don't know, if you have information on that, please let me know below, because I'm trying to understand this science. I closed the grill and opened both the top and bottom vents to let the grill heat up. I was aiming to land somewhere between 250 and 300 degrees for smoking, so I let that overshoot a bit because I was going to be opening this to assemble the grill once it got there. So I began to assemble my grill, starting with the heat deflector plates, followed by my X accessory rack, and then I put my pizza stone on top of that to get double indirect heat. I've seen a lot of people use the slow roller attachment for the Big Joe as well as the heat deflectors, but I don't have the slow roller, so I'm supplementing by using a pizza stone. This should help prevent the bottom of the brisket from burning and drying out through the cooking process. I finished with a little foil drip pan and then my 2 cooking racks. Then I fixed my meat thermometer into the fat side of the brisket. Then I placed it on the cooking racks, closed up the grill, and started to cook. Now here's where I ran into my first and probably biggest problem. I tried to close up my vents most of the way to inhibit overheating, but my grill kept shooting up past 300 degrees and it seemed like it wasn't going to stop. So I kept opening the lid to let the heat dissipate for a little bit before closing it and letting it heat back up. And I literally had to do this every like 30 to 45 seconds. I was just so afraid of it overheating and burning my brisket and overcooking it. And I didn't want to close the vents all the way because I was going to trap in a lot of that acrid smoke, and I definitely didn't want that. But it just seemed like there was too much fuel in there or something, because it just kept heating up without stopping. I also tried adding some water to the drip pan to absorb some of that heat, but that didn't help much either. And I started to get worried about opening the grill so much and letting all that smoke escape. I thought I was going to ruin everything. I frantically tried to research, and all I could find is that I had too much fuel in my grill. So I did this really dangerous thing where I took everything off the grill just so I could reach the coals at the bottom, and I just used some tongs and tried to remove like half the coals, which I have these heat-proof gloves, but they don't do a good job when you're sitting over that heat for so long. Also, these foil pans are not meant to carry these really hot coals because it started to melt through those, and I messed up my shelves of the grill. And yeah, it was just kind of all over the place, but I did manage to get about half the coals out, so I reassembled everything, closed the grill back up, and let it heat back up. And even still, I was having this overheating problem, although it wasn't as frequent, so I just kept opening and closing to try to regulate my temperature. And yeah, this is almost like 3.5 to 4 hours at this point. I was also spraying my brisket about every hour with that apple cider vinegar apple juice mixture. I was kind of just losing my mind when finally the grill started to regulate at almost 4 hours. It settled in between 250 and 275 degrees, which I was so happy with. All the while, my brisket was coming up at a pretty decent rate and I felt good about the temperature, but then came my next problem, and that's my temperature started to drop. Even with all my vents open, I didn't have enough fuel because my coals were starting to burn out at this point. And I believe that's due to opening and closing my grill so much that I lost so much heat and so much air that I burned out most of these coals. But yeah, maybe I should have been a little more patient with the heat rising so much, but I just didn't want to see it rise to like 400 to 500 degrees because that worried me. But either way, now I was dropping in temperature, and now my brisket was coming up close to that 170 degrees target. I did try to wrap it in this foil boat that I've seen online, which helps to trap some of that fat and let it start to baste in its own fat while still letting the top form a bark. But it was too far gone at this point. I was already running low on fuel, and I didn't feel like unassembling my grill once again to dump more coals into it, which I've already wasted a ton at this point. So at the 4-hour mark, with it almost at 170 degrees Fahrenheit, I brought the brisket inside and I wrapped it in some butcher paper, and I just decided to finish this in the oven. I figured the oven was much easier to regulate and hold at a constant temperature, and after 4 hours on the grill, I hopefully imparted enough smoke flavor into the meat. I mean, my wood chunks were already well disintegrated at that point, so I thought it was good. So I stuck this in a few layers of butcher paper and then put it into the oven fat side up, and put a tray underneath it to catch any drippings. And using the meat thermometer instead of the thermostat on the oven, I tried to regulate this to around 275 degrees Fahrenheit, which I noticed the ambient temperature was way lower than what I was setting it to on the oven. So I was setting the oven to like 300 to 315 degrees Fahrenheit to achieve that 275 reading on the meat thermometer. But I did start to feel comfortable that this was going to finally turn out properly, and I did see that expected temperature stall between like 150 and 170 Fahrenheit on the brisket, so I was really feeling good. And this took like 4 more hours in the oven, and it finally reached that second 205 degree goal after like 8.5 total hours of cooking. which was really good timing. I smoked it a little higher than maybe the average smoking temperature, but this got me a finished product a little faster. And just to be sure, I tested it with another meat thermometer to see how easy it slides in and out, and it was sliding in super easy, so I called it done here. So as a last step, I just left the brisket in the butcher paper and then put it into an old towel and wrapped it up. I used a little pin to seal it, and then I put it into a cooler. This is where I would achieve the final rest for about 2 hours and just let all the juices settle inside of the brisket. This was not a controversial point. Literally everyone says you should rest your brisket for multiple hours after cooking, and this was going to allow me to have this thing ready for like 5 p.m., which was the time we were planning to eat anyway. So the time had finally come, my family had arrived, and we were getting ready to eat, so I pulled the brisket out. Then I carefully put it onto a cutting board, and I did forget to do the jiggle test at this point, which I do regret because that's super important to me. But regardless, it was time to grab my serrated knife and slice in. So I first separated the point from the flat because the grains changed direction, which leads me to my absolute favorite part. Let's just admire the juice for a second. No, not perfect, but super satisfying. To finish up, I just cut up the flat into thick slices, and in some parts it felt a little tougher than I wanted, but I was okay with the result. I also tried the little flop test where you see if it folds over itself on the edge. It's a little bit stiff, but it also flops a little bit, so it's kind of somewhere in between. And then for good measure, I did the pull test as well, where it's not supposed to break under its own weight, but it should be pretty easy to pull apart. Again, not the easiest, but also not the toughest. Somewhere in the middle, so I'm satisfied. I tried to slice up the point as well, but it was too hard to slice, so it just kind of shredded into these bits, which I guess is a good sign because that means it's super tender. But we were left with tons of brisket to choose from. You can kind of see the pink smoke ring around the outside, and it did retain a lot of juices as you already saw. I think the injection and the resting helped with that a lot. The flat was probably a little more overcooked than I wanted it to be, but that's kind of a normal thing that happens to a lot of people their first time especially. And all issues aside, I'm still pretty happy with the result that I got. I thought it was going to be ruined, especially at the beginning, but this was a great 4th of July meal. My whole family pitched in. We served it with some crock-pot mac and cheese, some coleslaw, some corn on the cob, and then some dinner rolls. I also made some funnel cakes, which I make every 4th of July, and I'll show you that in next week's video. And again, no drawn out taste test here because I was with family, but I did taste a little bit on camera, as you can see. Again, it was super tasty and juicy and smoky, everything you wanted a brisket. I did learn a lot of lessons here, and my first brisket cook taught me a lot about the grill and just about cooking meat in general. And while it was super hectic and I had a lot of discouragement at first, at the end of the day, I left motivated to want to do this again, so I'm glad I feel that way and not the other way around. But if you're a grill master or you have any tips or any answers to the questions I had before, please let me know in the comments below, or if you just have something nice to say, let me know. Thank you for all your continued support. It means the world, and I'm super motivated to pump out more content and try more new things. As always, thank you for watching, be blessed, and I'll see y'all next time.